So let's backtrack for a minute. I believe what you're talking about is the issues around the gay bars. Where
Yes.
Can you go into that? Because a lot of people that I've interviewed, they kind of know, but you
Well, I started researching the history of the Seattle PD when I first got on, and now that I run the police museum and have been for 18 years, I've interviewed a number of people, officers and civilians included, which clarified that issue. The Seattle police and most police departments around the era of the 50s and 60s were poorly paid, and a lot of officers chose to supplement their incomes by putting the squeeze on businesses. And in Seattle, they put the squeeze on regular businesses, and they focused on the gay business people around the community to attempt to blackmail customers in exchange for payoff.
wow.
And it wasn't just the police involved in this in Seattle. There was all levels of government were involved in this. It went beyond the police department, to the sheriff's office, to the government officials, city officials, and it was quite a mess. And grand juries were convened in the late 60s, early 70s, and an attempt to rid that culture of that kind of behavior.
I heard that a city council people were removed, the police chief, is that true?
Police chief was removed, his second in command was removed, the county prosecutor, who was alleged to be involved in a lot of this, was voted out of office.
Wow.
And the system began to change. But this is a pretty big ship to turn around, especially when you've got systemic problems, such as with the days of the 60s and 70s, where even though you remove several people from those key positions, the culture itself was accepting of that kind of behavior. Now, not to say that all the officers were involved in it, because they weren't, but they were enough involved in it, and certainly the rest all knew about it, but felt helpless to act. So that is systemic corruption that had to be extricated from the department. It just had to go.
And by systemic, you mean some of the people that stayed on, did they sort of see the guys that were fired as maybe martyrs? Like they had...
Just recently in the last couple of years, the officers in this department, who have been long since retired, have started opening up about the corruption of the era. There are some that still deny it happened. There are others that admit to being part of it and are ashamed of it. And we still continue to interview officers and other people involved from their part. I went back to Washington, D.C. last year and interviewed William Chambliss, who wrote the book On the Take. And I'm not sure if you've read that, but that book clearly explains chronologically how this all started. And a fascinating read, and it opens the door to some of Seattle's secrets that they're not too proud of. And it was because of that the culture started to change, both within the city government and the police department, which brought us to where we're at now. We are nothing like we were, 35 or 40 years ago.
I've talked to a number of gay officers. There's only a handful that are out currently on the force, and they all have claimed that there's no issues as far as their employment goes, as far as their day-to-day work. They don't feel discriminated against. But was it always like that?
No, it wasn't. And to understand the early days of policing being a gay officer, you have to understand the culture. Remember, policing really, aside from technology, hasn't changed at all, or hadn't changed at all from the time policing began in the 1890s until the late 1960s. You had primarily straight white males. It was a very macho society back then. I'm sure there probably were gay officers, mostly females that were people suspected, but in polite company we didn't talk about that. The first gay officer I ever knew about was when I got hired, and it was quite it was a secret that was not well kept, and there was some controversy over that with the police chief and this particular officer. Whether that was because of personalities or because of incidents that happened, I don't know. All I knew is that as an officer that was still not out, I was watching this very carefully to see what direction this conflict was going in. Also remember that in the mid-70s you had a huge culture clash. You had the Vietnam War unrest, you had black unrest, you had the gay movement was in full swing, and you had women on the police department that were allowed to do the exact same things as their male counterparts.
For the first time.
Well, Seattle was unique in that we had black officers and female officers that were hired back in the 1890s and 1912. We were one of the first departments ever to do that. So that's a very proud thing to say, that Seattle has been progressive for a long time. However, in the 70s, when the officers that were female were given the same title and they dropped the word patrolman from the badges and from the documents, a lot of officers that were older had issues with that. And I think those issues resulted from them being protective of the women that were now being exposed to the same dangers as their male counterparts. I also think you had a fraternity that felt it was being invaded. And I think when you bring gay officers into this mix, it was something that nobody was ready for, including the officers that were on and not out.
So how did you stay sane and closeted while being a cop?
Well, I think then and even now, I think that most police officers in Seattle and probably everywhere else, they want to know that whichever new officers come into the department are able to do the job. I wanted to know that I was able to do the job, and I felt that by, sometimes when you come out and you make statements that aren't relevant to your job performance, that clouds a lot of issues, and I think with some people it makes them wary of, what your agenda is. I mean, I'm not an activist, and I didn't want to make my sexuality a stumbling block for me to progress through the police department, get past probation, and lock horns with the police administration over whatever issues I may have thought would have occurred at the time. So I stayed, I think most people realize that when you're in the closet, there's a time and a place to do it, and the timing has to be right. I think when you're outed by somebody, you don't have control over that situation, and it can turn into a bad scene if you don't have a strong support network to back you up.
So were you outed?
No, I wasn't. I think the documents I just showed you here, I was elected to the board of directors for a police union back in the late 80s, and we had a guild president back then that we were having issues with, both for financial impropriety and for his decision to go back to Washington, D.C. and testify before Congress against gays in the military, which President Clinton was trying to propose. When we found out that he was back there doing that, all of us were rather upset about that. The city was upset because as much progression as we had made involving the gay community, this was setting us back considerably. I was an East Side kid. I was born and raised in Bellevue. I'd never been around many black people, and I'd certainly never been around many gay people. And my first experience with that was that I was assigned to Capitol Hill Precinct, which in itself was a very controversial move. I remember when the city proposed to have the precinct moved from downtown to Capitol Hill, a lot of gay activists were against that. And it was a very public dissension that they were afraid that if a police precinct was in the east part of the city, that the police would continue, harassing, whether it be perceived or actual, and that they didn't want the precinct there. The precinct was eventually built there, and the community eventually was very grateful that they had officers that were able to respond much more quickly than they could from downtown. The squad that was in what we called Edwards Sector at the time and was made up of younger officers that some of which were in my situation, hadn't been around the gay community very much at all, and oftentimes were at odds with knowing how to speak and behave and interact with the community. And it caused friction. And it caused enough friction that it caused the police captain to remove most of those officers from the squad and replace the squad with officers that he handpicked that he thought would be objective in enforcing the law and connecting with the community.